It's 2023. A man is standing at the edge of a ramp, a literal cliff edge, on a motorcycle, somewhere in the Norwegian mountains. He's done this jump 500 times in training. His parachute is strapped, his helmet is on, and the cameras are rolling. But here's the thing nobody talks about. He's 61 years old. Most actors his age are doing prestige television, collecting Emmys, taking it easy. This man jumped off a Norwegian cliff on a motorcycle, then free fell, pulled his chute, and landed safely, just to give an audience a real thrill. And that image tells you everything you need to know about Tom Cruise. Because Tom Cruise is not a movie star who does stunts. Tom Cruise is a man who decided, somewhere deep in his soul, that he would never, ever stop proving himself, and then became a movie star. The question is why? Why does the highest paid actor on the planet, a man who has grossed over $10 billion at the global box office, still feel the need to hang off the side of an Airbus A400M at 25,000 feet? What is he running from? Or more accurately, what is he running toward? To understand Tom Cruise the icon, you have to go back to a boy named Thomas Cruise Maypother IV. Born July 3, 1962, in Syracuse, New York, Tom was the third of 4 children, with 3 sisters. Raised in a household that was, by almost every account, defined by 2 things, instability and fear. His father, Thomas Maypother III, was a deeply troubled man, an electrical engineer by trade, but what Tom would later describe as a bully and a coward. In a rare, searingly honest interview, Tom Cruise said his father was the kind of man who would hit you and then ask, "Why do you make me do this?" Think about what that does to a child's psychology. You learn, very early, that love and pain come from the same place. That the person who is supposed to protect you is also the one you need to perform for, to be good enough for, to survive. And it wasn't just emotional instability. The Maypother family moved constantly. By the time Tom Cruise was 14 years old, he had attended 15 different schools across the United States and Canada. 15 schools, 14 years. That means every single time he started to make a friend, to feel settled, to feel safe, the rug was pulled out again. But here's what's fascinating about young Thomas Maypother. He didn't collapse inward. He adapted. He became someone who could walk into any room and figure out how to belong. A chameleon. A reader of people. Someone who could make strangers like him fast. Because his entire childhood depended on exactly that skill. There was something else, too. Something that most people don't know. Tom Cruise had severe dyslexia. Not mild. Severe. He has described reading as feeling like the words were jumping off the page. He was placed in remedial classes. He struggled enormously in school, which, when you're already the perpetual new kid, compounds the social isolation in a brutal way. Imagine walking into school number 12, already behind academically, already branded as the slow kid, already knowing you'll have to earn your place in another new social ecosystem. Most kids would shut down. Tom Cruise channeled it into something else entirely. At Glen Ridge High School in New Jersey, a drama teacher named George Steinberg suggested Tom audition for a school musical, Guys and Dolls. Tom had no formal training. He'd never been on a stage. But he got the lead. And something clicked. For the first time in his life, there was a place where being different was an advantage. Where performing wasn't just survival, it was art. Where you could be someone else, and the whole room would lean forward and watch. He was hooked. In 1980, Tom Cruise made the kind of decision that most 18-year-olds would be terrified to even think about. He packed a single bag, bought a one-way ticket to New York City, and told himself he was going to be an actor. He had virtually no money. He had no connections. He had no agent, no training beyond one high school musical, and he couldn't reliably read the scripts he was hoping to land. Let that sink in for a second. He wanted to be a Hollywood actor, and reading was his greatest weakness. His first apartment in New York was barely habitable. He survived on almost nothing, sharing space with other struggling artists, taking whatever odd jobs he could. He trained obsessively, studying acting through the actor's studio approach, learning to memorize scripts by having people read them aloud to him because his dyslexia made pages treacherous. Every single audition was an act of sheer will. He walked into casting offices and competed against kids from Juilliard. Kids with formal training, wealthy families, connections, and clean reading skills. And Tom Cruise walked in with nothing but an almost supernatural intensity and a face that the camera seemed to love for reasons nobody could quite explain. He got rejected. Constantly. But here's what separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't. It's not talent. Or not just talent. It's the ability to reframe rejection. To walk out of a room where someone just told you no and think, that was practice. Next one. Tom Cruise, forged by a childhood of constant displacement and a father who withheld approval, had been training for exactly this kind of psychological endurance his entire life. In 1981, he got his first real break, a small part in a film called Endless Love, a Franco Zeffirelli drama starring Brooke Shields. His role was tiny, blink and you'll miss it, but the camera noticed him. His next role came in Taps, a 1981 military drama with Timothy Hutton and Sean Penn. He was so compelling on set that directors Harold Becker and Stanley Jaffe upgraded his role during filming. They couldn't keep him in the background. That's the thing about Cruise in these early days. He had this quality, this combustible focus, that made it impossible to look away from him. But even that was just the warm-up. Because in 1983, before the breakthrough arrived, came the moment that almost unmade him entirely. Losing It. A low-budget raunchy teen comedy that Tom Cruise did for money and exposure. It tanked. Critically demolished. A film so forgettable that most Cruise biographies gloss over it in a single sentence. But here's what that film represents in the arc of his story. It represents the moment where young Tom Cruise could have been categorized, pigeonholed as a B-movie pretty boy, shuffled into direct-to-video obscurity and forgotten entirely. In Hollywood, you don't always get a second act. Most people don't. Tom Cruise, somehow, was about to get one. Director Paul Brickman is developing a coming-of-age film called Risky Business. The story of a sheltered Chicago teenager who throws a party while his parents are away, and everything goes spectacularly, criminally wrong. The studio wanted a safer choice for the lead, someone more established. Tom Cruise was, at that point, still a wild card. Brickman fought for him anyway. And then came the scene that changed everything. You know the one. Tom Cruise, in a pink Oxford shirt, white socks, sliding across a hardwood floor. What most people don't realize is that the scene wasn't fully scripted the way it appeared. Cruise improvised much of its energy, the slide, the air guitar, the sheer abandon of it. And it became one of the most iconic images in cinema history. Overnight, Risky Business grossed over $63 million on a $6 million budget. Critics called Cruise a revelation. The trade started using the word star, but even that was just the opening act. Because in 1986, director Tony Scott was casting a film about Navy fighter pilots, Top Gun. Tom Cruise didn't just star in it. He inhabited it with a recklessness that, in retrospect, feels entirely autobiographical. He learned to fly. He spent time with actual Navy pilots. He pushed the physical demands of the role to extremes that even the film's technical advisors found alarming. Director Tony Scott said Cruise had an intensity on set that he'd never encountered before. Not aggression, not ego, just this unwavering, almost frightening focus on being the absolute best version of whatever the scene demanded. Top Gun grossed $357 million worldwide and became a full-scale cultural moment, the film that turned Tom Cruise from a rising star into a planet with its own gravitational pull. Where does that intensity come from? You already know where it comes from. It comes from a boy who moved 15 times and had to prove himself in every single new room he entered. It comes from a father whose approval was a moving target that could never quite be reached. That hunger, that almost pathological need to be undeniably, inarguably good, was forged in childhood trauma and lit on fire by Hollywood. After Top Gun, the trajectory was almost vertical. The Color of Money with Paul Newman, who would later say Cruise matched him beat for beat, which from Newman was essentially the highest praise a human being could receive. Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, a film that showcased Cruise's ability to hold his own against an actor widely considered one of the greatest of his generation. And then Born on the 4th of July in 1989, Oliver Stone's searing Vietnam drama that earned Cruise his first Academy Award nomination. Golden Globe winner, Oscar-nominated, box office king, all before age 28. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because success, when it arrives this fast and this large, doesn't solve anything. It just gives you bigger problems. The 1990s brought Jerry Maguire, Show Me the Money, becoming one of the most quoted lines in American pop culture. It brought Mission Impossible, which Cruise didn't just star in. He produced, took creative control, and turned into a franchise that, 3 decades later, is still running. And it brought, in 1996, a divorce from Mimi Rogers, a marriage to Nicole Kidman, an unprecedented level of tabloid scrutiny, and the beginning of the world's sustained, complicated, sometimes obsessive fascination with what was happening inside Tom Cruise's private life. Here is what we know about Tom Cruise the private person. And it is, admittedly, far less than we know about most major celebrities, which is itself a kind of story. Tom Cruise is, by virtually every account of people who have worked with him, extraordinarily disciplined. He wakes before dawn. He trains with the intensity of a professional athlete and has maintained what fitness trainers describe as an almost superhuman physical condition well into his 60s. He is a licensed pilot, a motorcycle enthusiast. He has trained in skydiving, rock climbing, underwater diving, and halo jumping, all for film roles that required it. The question of where the role ends and the man begins has long since stopped being answerable. The elephant in any room discussing Tom Cruise's private life is, of course, Scientology. Tom Cruise has been one of the most prominent and vocal members of the Church of Scientology since the mid-1980s. His relationship with the organization has been a source of immense public controversy, particularly surrounding his 2005 appearance on The Today Show, a televised confrontation that became one of the most watched celebrity interviews of the decade for all the wrong reasons. His public defense of Scientology, the couch-jumping moment on Oprah, the dissolution of his marriages, his estrangement from his daughter Suri. These are not small things, and they have shaped public perception of Tom Cruise in ways that have, at various points, genuinely threatened to derail the empire he spent his life building. In 2006 and 2007, Paramount Pictures, his longtime studio partner, did not renew his production deal. Paramount's then-chairman Sumner Redstone said publicly, and without diplomatic softening, that Cruise's behavior had cost the studio significant revenue. For the first time since 1983, Tom Cruise was on the outside. For most actors, that would be the beginning of the end. Tom Cruise, characteristically, treated it as a problem to be solved by working harder. He produced and starred in Valkyrie in 2008. Edge of Tomorrow in 2014, a film that bombed on opening weekend, was renamed Live, Die, Repeat on home video, and went on to become a beloved cult classic through word of mouth alone. And then came Mission Impossible Fallout in 2018, widely considered not just the best Mission Impossible film but one of the greatest action films ever made. A movie so precisely crafted, so relentlessly committed, that critics who had spent years writing Tom Cruise's cultural obituary had to quietly put down their pens. And then, Top Gun, Maverick 2022, a sequel to a 36-year-old film, released into a post-pandemic world where everyone said theatrical moviegoing was dead, starring a 60-year-old man reprising the role that made him famous. $1,490 million in theaters. During the so-called death of theaters, Tom Cruise didn't just survive the post-pandemic Hollywood collapse. He proved it wasn't inevitable. If you made something worth seeing, people would still come. So what do we do with Tom Cruise? He is not a simple story. He is not the uncomplicated underdog who made good and then became a gracious, beloved elder statesman of his industry. His life is messier than that, more contradictory, more human. He is a man shaped by violence and instability who found in performance a way to control his own narrative for the first time. A man whose relationship with his own faith has brought both community and controversy. A man who, by many accounts, is extraordinarily kind on set, who remembers the names of crew members, who shows up for people, who sends Christmas gifts to grips and gaffers, and yet who has navigated fatherhood and marriage in ways that have left public scars. He is not a saint. He is not a villain. He is something more interesting than either. He is a man who looked at the word impossible and heard it as an invitation. Because here is what Tom Cruise's story actually teaches us. Underneath all the blockbusters and the stunts and the tabloid covers and the complicated headlines, the thing that almost breaks you is usually the same thing that makes you extraordinary. The dyslexia that made him feel stupid in 15 different classrooms forced him to develop an auditory, kinesthetic intelligence that makes him electrifying on screen. The father who withheld love created a hunger for approval so vast that it drove him to jump out of airplanes in his 60s just to give audiences something real. The childhood of constant displacement made him a man who could walk into any environment, any set, any cockpit, any cliff edge, and adapt. There is something almost mythological about a man who, after 4 decades, is still running, still jumping, still refusing to phone it in, still strapping himself to the outside of a moving aircraft because he believes, deeply, genuinely believes, that audiences deserve the real thing. In an age of CGI everything, green screens and digital doubles and AI-generated faces, Tom Cruise is out there on an actual Norwegian cliff, on an actual motorcycle, actually jumping. Maybe it's obsession. Maybe it's trauma processed through adrenaline. Maybe it's the boy from Syracuse who just never, ever got comfortable enough to stop proving himself. Or maybe it's all of those things at once. Because that's the thing about the most extraordinary lives. They're never just one thing. They're a collision of pain and passion, of wound and gift, of the worst thing that ever happened to you becoming, somehow, the engine of the best thing you ever made. Thomas Cruise Maypother IV was told, in a dozen different ways, by a dozen different people across 15 different schools, that he wasn't quite enough. And his entire life has been, in some ways, one long, magnificent, defiant answer to that lie. He's still answering. At 61 years old, on a motorcycle, at the edge of a cliff. Still answering.